I don't know where I would have been had I done something else 20 plus years ago, right? I only know where I am now. And yeah, I think there's a hardness maybe, or a loss of innocence or whatever. Some of that not belonging I was talking about, that plays into this in some respect, because there's lots of things that I think I understand about the world, or a way that I look at the world, that would be really different from a lot of people. And I don't share it with a lot of people because that's not, they are happy to not know, right?
Right.
And so I think it can be, I think it's, in some ways it's easy to be hard.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that recognition is the important part. And, the people that I try to help, it's really hard, I think, for people to kind of acknowledge that, and then also try to, curry whatever amount of optimism or hope they can still connect to keep trying to have positivity in their lives.
Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Megan McElheran. Megan is a clinical psychologist and the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of Wayfound Mental Health Group, practicing in Calgary, Alberta. Her work over the last 16 years has been exclusively in the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of OSI, that's operational stress injuries, in active duty military, veterans, public safety personnel, so that includes police, firefighters, paramedics, corrections, and so on. Megan does extremely important work in the world, and I was very happy for her to sit down and chat with me for the second time, this time face-to-face, because I was lucky enough to catch her while she was visiting Halifax on a work assignment. In this episode, which is one of my longest, yet seemed to fly by, Megan and I talk about working hard, but not too hard, exercise as a catalyst for learning Stoicism, mental strength, intimacy and vulnerability in relationships, and much, much more. I really hope you enjoy this conversation just as much as I did. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Megan McElheran.
I'm trying to be more diligent about actually building breaks in, because I just love all of this, right? So it just is easy to do that till bedtime and get up and start doing it again. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se, but I also think there's value in practicing doing nothing, right?
Well, that's the interesting thing is when is it too much? When does it become workaholic, and when is it my work is meaningful? And that's where I'm at now, I'm trying to figure out where that line is, because from an external perspective, people look at me, and I'm sure they look at you as well, and they're like, you're a workaholic, you need to take time off. And for me, I'm like, no, I find a lot of meaning in what I do. And then the question is, how do you know when, because you do need some time off.
Right.
The question is, how do you know how much you need, and how do you know when you need it, right?
Right. Well, and I also think you get to decide what that right amount is and what that looks like, right? Like, I think for me, at least, the traditional, work hours and then leisure hours, like that just doesn't work for me. I don't want it that way, and it just doesn't fit with what's needed from me. So I feel like, maybe even on a day by day or week by week basis, it looks different. And I feel like I would know if I'm out of balance if I'm not enjoying it. Like if it feels like a burden. I feel like that's got to be some aspect of a marker of when it's too much.
Yeah. It's almost like when you lose motivation to do it as well. I think that's a cursor.
Totally.
Yeah, for sure. And then how often do you need a break? I mean, I like the Christian idea of even God needed one day off a week, right?
Totally.
So I've been trying to do that, but I find even if I take like a half a day some weeks, it depends on what it is, right? How busy everything is, but I don't know.
Well, and what does that look like, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it actually look like to take a break, right? So I feel like I take lots of breaks. Like, I go to the gym multiple times a week. I walk my dog, as I've told you before. Like, I'll go for a couple of hours every day of the weekend. And I love that time. And during that time, I'm oftentimes thinking and reflecting and coming up with ideas and, things like that, which I suppose is kind of work, but it's in nature, and I feel like I'm recharging, and my mind just kind of goes there because that's what I'm interested in thinking about, So to me, that counts, even though I think somebody else looking at it might say not, right?
Yeah, I struggle with that too, particularly with the gym. So you consider gym to be sort of a time off.
I do.
Yeah, like a rest.
Like it's my time.
Yeah.
I don't have a phone. I'm generally speaking, like I have a couple of things that I do. And like Saturday mornings, as an example, I go to this exercise class that's just hysterical. And I just go because it's fun. And I go with two of my girlfriends. And so we get to catch up. And it's like old style Jane Fonda aerobics. It's hysterical. Yeah. So like, yeah, I consider that time off, even though I'm exercising.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of doing it. I think it's helpful to think about stuff like that with some hobbies give back to you and some take away from you. Because, I mean, you can imagine drinking to be a hobby, right? And some people view it like that.
Right.
And we are in Nova Scotia.
Right.
So there is a history of alcohol here. But yeah, some, like the gym, for example, let's say you have a 40-hour work week. Yes, the gym is more, you could define it as work, but it actually takes away stress and gives you more energy to put back into your day job.
Right.
It puts you in a better mental space. So it's not a simple calculation of like, okay, I'm in the gym an extra hour every night, so that means I'm working like 50 hours. It's not that simple, right?
No. And I don't know. I do think there's this distinction maybe, and I feel like a very privileged person in the sense that of like having that true calling and really that true belief that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, right? And so like I was just telling you about the rucking, like we've taken on rucking. We did a 30-kilometer walk on Good Friday, and I have 30 kilometers on deck on May 13th, 40 on May 27th, and then we're doing 64 kilometers on June 24th, which takes a really long time, right? Mm-hmm. Like 30 kilometers is 6 hours-ish and up from there. But I don't consider that work. Like I don't consider that taxing or taking away from. Like as much as it's a physical exertion, it actually is kind of soul food, right? And there's something about the community that's coming together and the sense of accomplishment and even just some of the quiet reflection during a really long period of time doing any activity, right?
Yeah. Can you explain, I know you mentioned it to me, but what rucking is and the Stoic background or Stoic roots, I guess? Right.
So in military, there's a certain distance with a certain weight amount that a soldier must be able to meet or be able to accomplish. So the minimum is, as far as I understand it, 20 miles to get your infantry badge, and then you have to be able to ruck consistently for 40 miles with 35 pounds on your back. That is as far as I understand it, that's the standard ruck, and it's it's an endurance exercise, and it has the Stoic connection because, as you can imagine, that there really does become a mind over matter kind of component to that after a certain point in time, your body's just going to keep going so long as you can work your way through the inevitable mental barriers that are going to come up. And so I was actually introduced to this by Franklin Annis, who I can't remember if you know or not.
No, I don't.
No. So he's a military historian and a Stoic philosopher, and somebody that I met through an event called StoicCon, I think, a couple of years ago. And he goes on these solo ruck marches and really talked about how he's really been able to sort of hone his connection to Stoic philosophy and its principles through the process of rucking and all that is required. And so I heard him talk about it multiple times on his podcast, whatever. And then a colleague and I were just sort of chatting about the podcast that Franklin had done and said, well, why don't we try this? Like we, in the before operational stress program and in so much of how I focus my work, I talk all the time about Stoicism. And so it feels like, okay, well, let's do it, right? Like, let's actually put it into action. And I'm learning some things. Like I'm really, I think I've known a little bit about what it means to hit the so-called wall or whatever through endurance and distance sports I've done historically. And this is just putting it into practice in a different kind of a way. So we're doing this in June, and we're prepping and training to send a small team to the Bataan Memorial March next March in New Mexico. Do you know about what Bataan is?
No.
Okay. So the Bataan March was in Singapore or Indonesia in World War II, where there was a number of U.S. personnel who were captured and interned by Japanese forces, and they were forced to march this distance in Bataan. And again, I can't remember exactly where Bataan is, but It was tremendously difficult. Hundreds of people died. It was this extremely long distance. I think it was like 70 kilometers or something like that. No food, no water, very, very humid, hot, you can imagine. And there's very few, if any, survivors of the Bataan March left. And so the U.S. Forces and Foundation does this memorial march every year. And it's in New Mexico, which apparently, can be quite hot and arid. And it's very, very challenging terrain. So we're going to try and put a team in as a team event. You have to finish the event like within it's either 5 seconds or 5 minutes of each other. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So it's really, for me at least, it's trying to put some of what I believe in and, the Stoic ideas and the practices actually into tangible action.
Mm-hmm. Endurance sports seem to be, it's a different type of skill than, let's say, like an intense sport, such as like weightlifting.
Right.
Which I do. And there is endurance movements built into like a weightlifting program.
Yeah.
So I go through stages sometimes where I'm doing a lot of squats, for example, and it's the same kind of thing. It's not quite the level because you're still there in the gym. You're not walking for miles and miles, but there is that element of like if you do. I've done 10 by 10 squats, which is 10 sets of 10 reps squats, and when you get to, honestly, after set 5, you're kind of hating yourself a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of got to push through to get to 7 and then 8 and then 9 and then 10. And the last set, it always seems to be easier for some reason. But it is a weird skill that I think just takes time to develop. Like, I don't know. I suppose because I have seen some people just go for endurance
mm-hmm.
and they got it in their head that they're going to do it, and then they just do it, and then they suffer afterwards because their body wasn't for it.
Totally.
But it does seem to be like a huge mental game to it, right?
I think so. I mean, many years ago, I used to run long distances, and for sure, a long distance run would be easier based on the amount of training that you had done, without question. Because you're just socializing yourself to, I can do this, I've done this before, etc. I think, I don't have any interest in running long distances anymore, but I really, really like to walk. And partly, I think, for me at least, running, I'm distracted by the fact that I'm running and what's my pace and I'm out of breath and whatever. Whereas walking, I walk at a pretty decent clip, but there's more mental freedom. And so in many ways, I think there's the benefits of that. For me, that really is a space or a vehicle for creativity, and I do some of my best thinking when I'm, well into a long walk. And then because of that, I think there's also a lot more space of, for boredom, and it's easy to start talking to yourself about how you could really easily give up here, and
mm-hmm.
you've gone far. You know what I mean? Like, I think you have there's even more space to confront the things that your mind wants to tell you can't do when you're trying to do sort of a big feat like that.
Yeah. That's the part I think people that aren't really into exercise, I think they think sometimes that it's just a physical thing. It's way more of a mental thing, and you do get that voice in your head that'll tell you, I can't do this, you can't do this, right? And the only response to that is, well, yes I can, I'm going to do it anyway, right? But it's a weird thing because you'll tell yourself that you can't do it, but you kind of know in the back of your head that you can, you just don't want to. Right.
That's exactly right. And how much do you give in to rationalizing all the reasons why you should give in to the fact that you can't do it because you don't want to, right? And to me, like, we are trying to train, and partly, I'm even talking with some of the folks who are on my team doing this who are relatively new to sort of distance exercise, etc. And it is a little bit tough because, when we finished 30 kilometers, like, I definitely had some hip soreness and my feet were hurt and whatever, but I've just walked 30 kilometers. Like, of course that would be the case, right? And so I'm trying to figure out where's the distinction between like hurting myself, because I'm not interested in that, and then tolerating the natural discomfort that's going to come along with doing that kind of a degree of endurance exercise, right? So I'm trying to figure that out. That's part of sort of my experimentation right now. Because I don't think anybody should be trying to injure themselves in that way. But it really is way more about, you have to not give yourself an out. I've always felt that way, right? Like, I know that on June 24th, I don't care how long it takes, I will finish 64 kilometers. Like, I just know that, because I can't give myself an out of, well, I just could. Because the moment I do that, then I will. And like, I think that could apply to, any of the maybe less helpful behaviors we can engage in, eating, drinking, drugs, smoking, whatever, right? If you give yourself that permission when you're in a moment of distress or difficulty or pain or whatever, it's really easy to go, well, I know I've kind of got that thing there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's a trick to this too with this long endurance stuff. You can tell yourself, it's hard to tell yourself, okay, I'm going to walk 20 more kilometers. But what about one more kilometer? What about one more step? This is very helpful in when you're doing high volume squats, because you'll do a rep. You'll do 2 reps. You think, oh, I got 8 more, right? It's like, well, I don't need to do 8 more. I just need to do 1 more. And then let me see how I feel. And then you do 1 more, and you say, okay, can I do 1 more? Yeah, let me do 1 more and see where I am there, right? And you can actually do that throughout the whole set, and it's a very helpful thing. And because I think we do this in life a lot too, is we see where we want to go, but that's important. It's important to have that vision. But at the end of the day, we have to focus on what's in front of us right now, what's right here. And we have to realize that it's that journey is just one step at a time. Exactly.
And we have to, I think, try to catch ourselves in the process of erecting all of the barriers and manufactured reasons why we can't do something, right?
100%.
Like, I completely agree with you. And we tend to have in like our common language, I just can't do this, I can't stand it. And I think we can do that when we're facing difficult things. Like, if we keep on with the endurance idea, I can't do it. Well, you know what, you are doing it. And I agree, like, it might just be, can you do 5 more steps? Can you do 2 more steps? And, before you know it, you continue to tolerate things, you continue to endure things. And I think that is some of what we need to do. It's like, break things down into bite-sized chunks that are actually manageable to do, and then reassess, right? Because I bet if you think you can't handle it for 1 more second, you're going to be able to go for 5 more seconds and find out, lo and behold, you did, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know, too oftentimes I think we can find ways to sabotage our efforts.
100%. We get that voice in our head, and I think it's important for people to know, and I'm by no means a high-level athlete or anything like that, but I've been exercising for most of my life, and that voice just never goes away, and I don't expect it to go away. It's like pretty much every day, unless I've taken a few days off or I couldn't get to the gym because of work and I'm a little excited to go, if I'm on my regular routine, there's always that reluctance. There's that voice that says, I don't want to go. I just want to watch TV or do this or do that. And telling that voice to just shut up sometimes and getting that habit, I think that's really important. But it's important for people to realize that voice is never going to go away.
And you have to befriend it. You have to learn to live with it. And I think, it's also, for me at least, it's about not depriving myself of, like we were talking about, the breaks or the pleasure or the time to be lazy or whatever. It's just delaying it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, I just know that there's going to be too much of a cost to how I feel about myself for me to, not go to the gym or not follow through on this goal that I've set myself or whatever. At the end of the day, it's only going to erode how I feel about myself, let alone anything else. And frankly, nothing else matters. So it's better for me to stay true to what I'm trying to do with my life and live it in a values-based way and be completely respectful and honoring of my own word to myself, and delay the things that I want to do that then allow me to be lazy or seek pleasure or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing, and it's not directly stoic, but you can actually use your fear to work for you. And this gets complicated because people think, okay, well, courage is you ignore fear. That's not entirely true, but you can fear, for example, the 2-hour workout that you have to do. You can be afraid of that. And you probably will, right? Like, I'm still afraid of the workouts I do. And you have to be somewhat afraid because they have to be challenging enough for you. You can also fear, as you mentioned, the person that you will become if you don't go to the gym today and tomorrow and the next day, and you do that for a year and for 5 years and for 10 years. You can think, oh, who am I going to be if I continue to listen to this voice telling me to be weak, essentially, to not do what I have to do. And then now you have two fears. It's like, which one do you fear the most? And for me, I know which one I fear the most.
Well, and if I keep letting myself down, right? Like if I keep saying I'm going to do something and breaking that promise to myself. I mean, I know for myself, I know for anyone, at the end of the day, the cost of that is I'm not going to trust myself. I'm not going to believe in myself. And then when you don't have that respect and that trust of yourself, there's all sorts of things that come from that, right? Then it's so easy to keep cutting corners in your life in ways that maybe are really inconsistent with how you want to be, right? And that's just too high a cost to pay.
And how do you evaluate in terms of cutting corners? Because I think sometimes you have to, sometimes there's room for that, but it gets tricky, right? So for example, your mother comes to visit and she brings you a birthday cake, or not a birthday cake. Let's just say she brings you a sweet treat, and you weren't planning on having a cheat meal today, but you have this stoic pro-social obligation to enjoy this. So you could argue perhaps that that's cutting a quarter in one regard of your life, maybe not in a more holistic view of your life, but maybe just in the fitness area. So there's you have to be flexible, I think. But to your point, you also have to hold yourself to a very high standard and make sure you're not cutting corners unnecessarily. So how do you weave that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to, and I would completely agree, is that we are constantly faced with dilemmas where our values are in conflict, right? And so like if my mother were to come and she's done this really thoughtful thing, I wouldn't want to in any way make her feel badly or like she misstepped or put me in an awkward position. And so my inclination would be to say, this is really lovely of you, and absolutely I'll have some. And probably for me, rather than the whole thing, I would try to have a minimum amount of it. And I know my mother, she would be totally respectful of that. So it would be a bit of a both and, right? And then it would be okay. So something unexpected happened here. And this means that where I might have had a little bit more slack at some other point in my week or in my day, I just no longer have that. And that's because I've made this choice for this pro-social obligation and to tend to my mother's feelings. But that therefore means I've now closed another option. Right. So maybe I was going to have dessert on Friday night. Well, that's not it anymore. Right. And this is a constant conversation I have with myself.
Yeah.
Because I could do this all the time. I could indulge myself 24/7 and very oftentimes do. Like, and I don't have any issue with that, but I really do balance the scales. Right. Like, I'm not sure that it's always great, but for me, it's about like I need to have met and maybe even sometimes exceeded what I have set out to do for myself in order to really be able to enjoy the things that I set aside that are pleasurable.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, you earn it in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If you have chips every night, it's not going to be a special thing to you. It's the new norm.
Yeah. And I'm trying to shift because there's so many mixed and really unhelpful messages around exercise and performance and food and nutrition, whatever. So I'm really trying to not tie exercise to food as a reward and really take food off the table. Food is nourishment and whatever. For me, it's about, if I'm rucking, which is physically taxing and doing all of these things, for me, it's about, okay, I am going to spend whatever, and I'm going to go and have a 90-minute massage or something, which is like a total treat and delight for me. Because then it's like, my body needs it because I've been putting all of this exertion on it. But it's like, I love that more than anything. Because again, I can put my phone away. Nobody can find me. I get 90 minutes to like kind of nap and just be really taken care of, right? Like, so that's kind of how I'm trying to balance it a little bit.
So you seem to be really good at picking, let's say, rest activities that benefit the other elements of your life.
I think I've gotten better at that. Yeah. Okay. Like I do think, and, as we were just talking about, I'm trying to learn things that really do feel like true rest.
Yeah.
which isn't always easy.
Yes, interesting. True rest. That's a nice phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you mean? I think I know what you mean. What do you really mean by that?
Well, like, so for me, going on a beach holiday, as an example, is not necessarily a true rest, because I don't get to take my phone and put it away and shut off my, like, I just don't. It's not feasible for how my work life and my career is. So a true rest for me is where I actually get to just be with myself. And so when I go to the gym, that's a true rest, even though I'm exercising. A massage is a great example of that. If there's other pockets of time, if I go to, I don't know, if I go to a play or something like that, that doesn't happen very often. But like those pockets where I really have carved out a discrete amount of time where there's going to be no interruptions, and I just get to focus on either what's happening around me or to me or for me, and that's it.
Just being present where you are. Yeah.
And free from interruptions.
Yeah.
That's the big part for me, because I don't think we are ever truly free from interruptions.
It's getting worse and worse. It's almost impossible now, unless you voluntarily choose to go that route, to set aside time where I'm not gonna turn off notifications. And it's so crazy because we don't even allow ourselves to get bored anymore or to sit with ourselves. Like, you get in an elevator by yourself, first thing you do is you haul out your cell phone.
Totally.
And and I do this. I'm not blaming anyone, but I try and, to your point, take the time and just think, well, maybe I can just take this time just to be. And I don't need to always, grab this phone, this device, and then fill my mind with meaningless stuff. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in sitting. And maybe you can relate to this, but when I have, let's say, a lot of things on my plate, when I'm really stressed out and I have so many things going on, at the end of that, if it's really exhaustive at the end of that, sometimes I'll just sit, or I'll just lie down for like hours, and I'm just processing. I'm not on my phone. I'm not watching anything. I'm just processing. And the state of bliss, and I'm not joking, it's blissful. Like just to sit and be able to process what I had to deal with and life and this and that. So that true rest.
Totally.
To your point.
Totally. And I think your nervous system and your body and your psyche is just like, oh, thank God, finally, It's so, I think we align here, because I have to practice being bored. Like, I have to actively work at not filling myself up. So like, even on the weekend, so I came out here on Sunday, I had to leave first thing in the morning Sunday, worked a full day Friday and busy last week. And there's so much going on right now that's all super exciting. And then came to Saturday, and I'd had like a really hard workout on Friday, and so I was like quite sore, and my friends weren't going to exercise class. I was like, okay, I'm just going to take the dog for a walk. I did that, and then like I had nothing in front of me, and I was talking to my husband. I was like, well, what should I do? Should I go do this? I should try and book that. And he was like, why can't you just do nothing? And so I was like, that is an excellent question. and so like I forced myself, and ultimately like it was actually really good. Like, I lay on my bed and I read my book, and then I had like a 3-hour nap. And I was like, I didn't feel tired, but the fact that I was able to sleep that long kind of told me that probably I've been a bit sleep deprived. And then I got up, and it felt really kind of odd. And I almost felt almost a little bit guilty. But then I was like, what am I guilty about?
Yeah.
But so I'm just so used to being busy and the going and the adrenaline. And I do think there's a kind of fuel that comes off of that. It's way harder nowadays to just, turn off the screens, turn off the phone, even just be with myself.
Yeah.
Strange times we're in.
Just to be with yourself. It's I think people think of boredom as a bad thing, and I don't think it is. It can mean different things. For a lot of people, I think the evolutionary psychology reason for it is it's an indication that maybe you should be doing something a little bit better with your time. But depending on who you are, and for example, if you're like yourself, who you tend to work a bit too much, feeling that boredom can actually be an indication of, okay, maybe I'm restful, maybe I'm peaceful, maybe I have enough time, because when you get into that cycle, and I really understand that, you never feel bored. Like I very rarely feel bored unless I block off time, like in a significant amount, maybe like a full day or two, and I just have nothing in the books. And then eventually I'll feel bored, but I won't right away. But I will.
You see, and I think that's so interesting. I find that there's almost two, and I'm not sure therefore if it's boredom or restlessness, but if, like, let's say I'm in the middle of a day or week that's quite demanding or what have you, and I have an hour or two open, I will very quickly feel bored. And so that's where I feel like I'm on my phone, I'm on this, I'm doing that or the other. Whereas if, let's say I had a week off or something, or a couple weeks off, I would probably get to a place where, I could lay around and read a book for 6 or 7 hours of the day and then maybe kind of be like, oh yeah, I'm kind of bored. It feels different. Like there's a qualitative difference.
Interesting. I know what you mean. And that's a scary thought for me too, because you can train yourself for both. You can train yourself to work pretty hard and hopefully take some time off. Or you can train yourself to enjoy taking too much time off. And I think that's a habitual thing that you train. And so this is something that I fear in some ways. And it's not an issue I have, but I do fear, let's say if I take too much time off, when is this going to be comfortable? And then I know the short term, let's say pleasure that comes from that is tempting. But the long term downside of that is that, well, I haven't advanced in my career. I haven't gotten anywhere in the gym. I gained a bit of weight.
Right.
I feel bad. Those are the mid to long term consequences. But in the short term, it's like, oh, I can take a month, 2 months, 3 months. Let's just get by with work. Let's not put in any extra focus. Let's maybe just get in the gym for 10 minutes. Maybe let's not go today,
Totally. I totally know. And it's funny because I actually have this fear about myself that, like, I do believe that deep inside of myself is a really lazy person. Like, I sometimes wonder if I had months off, I'm like, I wonder if I would ever get to a point of being like, stop laying around like a slug and do something. And I'm not convinced that I would,
I think eventually you reach that stage of quiet desperation.
Yeah, okay.
I think, because I went through that phase a little bit when I graduated university. I was very exhausted. It was like 5 years of engineering study. And I kind of did like a 9 to 5, 8 to 5 job. I worked a little bit extra, but, I was just kind of getting by. I wanted to rest, but that caught up with me. It was good for a couple of years. And then it was like, okay, no, this isn't, like, I'm ready. I got to get back at it. Now I'm, really, really happy with where I am in my career and really focused on the work. But I don't know. I think if you have the, hopefully maybe a little bit of wisdom to know that this is quiet desperation and you know how to get out of it and it's going to be hard, but you're willing to accept the difficulty, I think you would probably crawl out of it. I don't know. A lot of people are in that state, which is why I hesitate to say people would, because people could and a lot of them don't for whatever reason.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And I do think the difference now would be, like, I know how this feels, I know how it feels to feel vital and engaged and contributing and all of the things. And I like it, and so I think that experience or experiential knowledge would eventually get me up off the ground.
Yeah.
But I think I might lay there for
a
little while. Yeah.
So you mentioned being vital, and I think that's a core Stoic idea of being useful to the world. But there's an interesting paradox there where you're useful to the world, but the world could also go on without you. Memento mori kind of thing. And those are paradoxical viewpoints. And sometimes I have to tell myself, don't take yourself so seriously. It's like, yeah, I'm important. Yeah, I'm doing good things. Yeah, I'm helping people. But in 100 years, I'm not going to be here, and someone else is going to be doing this.
Right.
So do you find yourself balancing those viewpoints?
1,000%, totally. The way I put it to myself often, and I hope it's okay to say this on the show, but it's like, don't buy my own bullshit, right? I can get easily caught up in the stuff, and it's like, yeah, you are a grain of sand. The vital to me is really, and I think this is a Stoic ideal as well. It's like, we have zero time. Like we have so little time. So like, make like really stretch yourself and experience the limits of what this has to offer, because it's not going to be around for very long. And I feel that more and more and more every single day, right? So even the notion of being lazy, which I can kind of joke around with, like I don't want to, I've come to a place where I'm like, I don't want to be sitting around watching television. I don't want to sit around reading things on my phone, apart from minor distractions or whatever. Like I don't want to spend hours of my day doing that because time is running out, and that idea of like, imagine you died, right? Now go get busy living, I really love that. And I think that's for me a big part of where the vitality comes from.
Yeah, 100%. And I think all the Stoics are, well, I would say Marcus Aurelius and maybe Seneca are great examples of that. Marcus Aurelius, obviously, he was a Roman emperor and felt that was his duty and definitely worked. But then you also see passages in Meditations where he's looking at, what was the example? He was looking at a table or something, and he was looking at the patterns in the wood, and he was describing how there's order to nature and the chaos. So you can imagine maybe he's in this meeting with people, or maybe he's dealing with all these very hard, difficult decisions, surrounded by death and war, and he's taking the time to look down at the wood on his desk and think, wow, look at that pattern. Look at that beautiful thing. And it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, and then you miss so much beauty in the world. And so I think it's vital to also take a step back sometimes and just to be present. And people don't often associate that with Stoicism, that idea of just like, let's just look at the sun for a bit. Let's just look at the trees. But I think it's very core in Stoic practice. I think if you follow the Stoic path, that's something that just kind of comes naturally.
Well, and I think the practice of contemplation and something that I keep very close at hand is the bird's eye view, right? Like there's absolutely nothing, I really believe this, there's absolutely nothing that I'm contending with right now that I'm going to even remember in a year's time or 5 years time or whatever. Now, there are your exceptions to that, like if I was to lose a loved one or something like that, but that's not really what I'm talking about. The stresses and the inconveniences and the things that can get me really fired up during the day, I have to pause myself sometimes and be like, Megan, can you try to be more stoic about this, right? Because it's not that it doesn't matter in the moment, but it's just not going to matter in the long run, right? And again, we lose so much of our time, this very limited commodity that we have, being caught up in things that just fundamentally are not going to matter.
Yeah. It's such a huge thing in Stoicism to be able to change perspective. But I think what people don't talk about enough is how difficult it is to acquire that perspective. So you mentioned if you went through let's say a lazy phase, you could sit there in your, let's say your slobbiness, your slothiness, and you could think, well, a couple years ago, I was really into my work and I was traveling and I was very engaged and I felt a lot better than I do now. Yeah. That's perspective.
Yeah.
But how did you get that perspective? Right? Like, is that perspective, can everyone just acquire that? And I don't think so. I think it takes lived experience and maybe if you're really smart, maybe you can learn from other people's experiences, but I think that's very hard to do. So the perspective thing, it's not simple. It's not as simple, I think, as just change your perspective.
No, it's not. I think if it was that simple, then lots of people would, right? Because I think a lot of people out there are seeking that. How do I improve my life? And they oftentimes get told, well, it's the power of positive thinking or manifest something or whatever. And if it was that easy, people would do it, right? I think you and I have talked about this before. I mean, how does one acquire wisdom, right? And perspective and all these things, from my vantage point, that only comes through oftentimes very difficult process of working through suffering, and I talk about that lots with people that, maybe the output or the end state of some of the very difficult things that people go through is that they have a different, perspective. They have more wisdom on really what matters, So I think some of this for me there is an interplay with the fact that I just have a very, sort of alive and nascent understanding that things in life can change like that, and so live with respectful gratitude for the moment that you're in. Like it's really cool that you and I get to do this right now. This is a privilege, right? And there's any number of things that could change in either of our lives that would rob us of this opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Great perspective. And I think the because we're both Canadian, I want to bring this up because I have a lot of American listeners, and I love my Americans. Yes. But there's this idea sometimes of winter as being this terrible thing, almost like. like you're just going to be in misery the whole time. And what you're talking about there is sort of how things naturally change.
Yeah.
That's one of the lessons that living in this region gives me. Because, I mean, we just had winter. Winter was just finished. At the start of winter, you dread it a little bit because you got to shovel and it's going to be cold. But before you know it, it's over. And then you have spring. And then all of a sudden spring's gone and it's summer and you think, oh, wow, it's going to be a great summer. Then all of a sudden summer's over and fall's here. And I think the change of season is such a great reminder of how impermanent every state that you are in just it is. It's very impermanent. It's a constant change.
And I noticed this certainly. I've really tried to get out of what I used to do, and I'm not perfect at it by any stretch, but I'm trying not to live my life looking forward to the next thing.
Yeah.
Like when this happens or when summer's here or whatever, because then I'm wishing my life away. And I think you're dead on. Like these moments that we have, they just fly by. I still, if you asked me how old I am based on how I feel on the inside, I'd probably say 26. Right. Yeah. And there's a 20-year difference there. Right. and time is not going slower. And I'm seeing, the inevitable things that are going to happen in my lifetime, are no longer these abstract notions. Right. We've had lots of loved ones who have died in the last few years. Like that's just a reality that is coming. More people that I love will no longer be around. And eventually I'm going to look back and ask me again, and I'm going to say, oh, I feel 45 and I'm going to be 65, So I don't want to keep living my life with the next goalpost and missing what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And I know that that's a very easy thing to say, especially from the position of true privilege that I occupy. But I really hope that I can, like, if I have any influence or if I can be a model of any kind, it really is about that.
And how do we get there? That's the hard question.
Yeah.
It's like what? Meaningful work, good relationships.
It all comes down to relationships, I think. Yeah. And first and foremost, it really comes down to, I think, how you are with yourself. Like if you are really willing to stay and to learn and to be connected to like what you actually are about, where your soft spots are, where you thrive, like I think it has to start there.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I'm only ever going to engage with you pursuant to a version of me I think I am.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think so too. I think it all starts from within, and I don't think it's as cut, but because what happens is, so we're having this conversation, right? And you could say we're helping each other towards wisdom. You're helping me become more wise. Hopefully I'm helping you become a little bit more wise. So there's this mutual thing. And I think we do that for each other and for the people we care about. And also just in general, we help guide each other forward. And it's stumbling. It's not a walk and it's not a run. It's a stumble. And, I was thinking, I was driving today and I was thinking about that idea of stumbling forward. And I was thinking like, well, if you stood up straight and then you fell down, but you fell forward, and then you stood up where you are, you would still be a little bit forward. You still have a bit of progress. Right. And then if you fell again and you stood up, you'd be a little bit further ahead as well. So even if you're failing all the time, which I know I do, you can still move towards something better. And I think that's an encouraging thought.
I think so too. And, I think back to this notion of kind of the relationship we have with ourselves, you have to trust that if you fall over and hopefully fall forward, that you'll get back up. Like I think if that's a way to sum up what the wisdom of life needs to be about, it's that, right? Like it ain't going to be easy. It's not easy for anyone. And sure, some people have greater or more that they have to contend with, and who knows in the sort of cosmic roll of the dice why that happens. But I think that's one of the things, is that you just have to believe, and you have to know that you're just going to keep getting up.
Yeah.
And you do that enough times, and lo and behold, you're nowhere near where you started from.
Yeah.
And all the things you learn along the way.
Yeah. It's it's one of those things where I think you need a couple of wins in the bag. I think you need to win a few times to get that momentum. And I think that's why when we're children, and what we do for our children is we walk them through some things. Like if you that maybe your child should learn guitar or piano or play sports or something like that. A lot of times they don't want to do it, and you have to kind of walk them through it. You have to hold their hand and say, we're going to do this. Mm-hmm. And then they get something that nobody can really give them. They have to walk the steps, and you have to sometimes force them to walk the steps. But then they realize that they can actually get better at something. Mm. And then from that, you get projected into the life that we all live, which is, I'm going to fail. I'm failing right now, and it doesn't feel good. It never feels good. Mm-hmm. But I've also been here before, and I know I can get back up again, and I know I can keep going. Mm-hmm.
Such an interesting idea, because immediately what I was thinking about is like, well, so then what about kids who don't have those people,
That's
right?
Sad. Yeah.
What do I think that does, right? Like, I think to some extent, if kids, grow up and, either these are in households where there's actual neglect and clear abuse, or whether it's just a mismatch between what the kid needed and what parents have to offer. I mean, I don't know what, right? I think that compromises perhaps the kid's experience of safety and security and attachment and all those things. And so how does that then influence their trajectory in life? Because certainly we know that it's not only people who come from really advantaged and supportive and secure, developmental experiences that go on to do incredible things. Like, actually, oftentimes the opposite is true, right? Yeah. So what happens there?
Well, there's an idea that Joe Rogan talks about sometimes, and I love this. He said after he had kids, he started looking at people, and he used to look at people, let's say someone that cut him off in traffic or something like that, and he'd be like, this guy's an asshole. And after he had kids, he realized that guy was a baby once. Like, he was just a pure person, and then life happened.
And then life got a hold of him.
Right? Yeah. And we're all somewhere on that scale of, let's say 0 to 100. Like, none of us are sages, and none of us are also completely evil. Also, we're all somewhere on that spectrum. But it's a humbling idea to think, and you can have compassion for people that might not have made it in life, to think, well, they were just a child at one stage, just like me, right?
Well, that's empathy. That's the point of empathy, right? Is to be able to look at someone and see beyond a frustrating or problematic behavior, and actually be willing to kind of contend with the fact that there's a human being underneath that, right? And I'm with you. I don't believe that most people ebb towards the evil end of the continuum. I think most people are trying to do their absolute best. And usually when we see problematic things, it's because they're ill-equipped, they're ill-supported, they've been hurt in some kind of way, and that tends to bring about, troublesome things, and it's really hard. And, I say this significantly in the work that I do, because I work, as you know, with a lot of police officers and whatever. It's really hard to see people in our communities who are maybe acting in really troublesome ways or being really aggressive. Like, it's super hard to see, again, the person behind that, But I think we have to set that as a really important goal for ourselves, because that is where we find our humanity. Like, if I can look at someone who has done something horrific and clearly is regretful about it, and try to find the human being inside of that. That's a heck of a lot harder than just writing that person off as being a piece of shit, right? Seeing that person had X, Y, and Z's part of their context that contributed to what happened. I think that's a harder place to be.
100%. And we make all these judgments. I heard Mike Tyson talk about this because he's just an insane boxer back in the day and just destroyed people, right? And someone asked him one time what was difficult about it, or what was he feeling before each match, and he would always say that he was afraid, period, but he was also afraid of how the person's relatives would feel about him just beating the shit out of the guy. He said, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to hurt this person, and the people that love that person are going to feel that. And he said he suffered from that. He'd have that before the match, and then after the match he would have to deal with that guilt. You think, well, why the hell would you do something like that? And it's not always as simple as you get your high school degree and then you go get your bachelor's and then you go do a career. It's like people are in very difficult situations, and a lot of times people don't know any better, or they don't think that they can do any better. So it's so fascinating because people see him as this brute. It's like you're not seeing what's going on.
Well, and I'm just sitting here thinking about, I wonder what he might have been like when he was, 10 or 11 or early into his adolescence or whatever. He must have, at some point in time, the world must have started to engage with him as this really tough, intimidating guy. And, maybe from a place of, adaptation and self-protection, he started to live up to what other people were sort of seeing in him. And that may or may not actually have been true for what was truly inside of him,
100%.
So how hard would it have been for Mike Tyson, maybe at earlier points in his life, to actually really receive accurate empathy and love?
Yeah.
Because people probably didn't look at him that way. They probably just looked at him as being made of steel or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. Where did that idea come from? There's an idea. I think it's actually... Oh, it's Shrek.
Oh, it's Shrek.
It's Shrek. I'm going to bring up Shrek.
Okay, let's do it.
So in Shrek, the first Shrek movie, the movie starts and he's an ogre.
Right.
And he's an ogre species, the species of ogre, but he's also the personality of ogre. There's people coming with pitchforks and he's scaring them off, and he's wants to be alone. He's pushing everyone away. He's being this brute. But then they find out after that was all a facade. The reason he was acting like that was because the world told him that that's what he was.
Right.
So that's a very crazy yet true thing in life, is that if the world tells you you're something, even if you don't feel like that, sometimes you'll act that out if that voice is strong enough. And if you don't have anyone that cares enough about you to show you the beautiful sides of yourself, which he eventually had with Donkey and and Fiona, right?
Totally. I think that's a beautiful example, right? And we have so much to learn from these things that seemingly appeal to children, right? And I think, if you started being told you were something or a certain way or whatever, geez, I hope that you have gotten to a certain point in your own development of who you are before that starts happening. Otherwise, you're going to be so vulnerable to absorbing that and having that become who you are.
Mm-hmm. You know? I think you need someone to care about you.
Yes.
I think you really do.
Yeah. And you need to have someone or something to care about.
Yeah.
Right? It's equally important.
And you don't need a lot either. No. You need 1-2 people. And if you have 1 or 2 people that actually give a shit about you, I got a buddy of mine, when he knows I'm driving late for work, he'll always call me, he'll check in on me to make sure I got home. And it's like, to have anyone that gives a shit about you at all in that capacity, man, it's such a blessing. It's
such a gift, and I think about this a lot. There was a guy that I went to high school with, and he clearly had an intellectual disadvantage. I'm not exactly sure what it was. And I just, So we would have been like in grade 10 or something like that, grade 11. And I used to go home and I would be so upset at night because I would think about him being lonely, because, we criticize and cast out people who are different, right? And I don't think that was his story. I actually think he was welcomed in much different ways. But I just remember my heart used to break thinking, like, I hope that people aren't mean to him. I hope he's not lonely at the end of the night. And, fast forward however many years, and I still feel that way. Like, I think like loneliness and not having someone to care about you or have someone to care for, like, I think that's probably one of the worst experiences we can have as humans.
And the interesting thing about that is, in the Stoic sense, that's one of those things that's outside of your control. But here's the interesting thing. Obviously, if you live the Stoic path and you become more virtuous, you're going to invite people into your life. So there is that element. But here's something interesting I thought about a few weeks ago, is that you can think of luck in the Stoic sense as externals. So let's say a friend does something for you. That's outside of your control, but maybe they do something nice for you. They help you move or something like that. That's luck because it's something that's not within your control, that's helping you and providing you with a good experience, let's say, or a good relationship bonding. But you can't request luck. You can't demand luck, but you can give it. You can give luck. You can tip people well. You can be kind to people. You can help your friends. You can call them. You can give luck to people.
You can do all of those things. And I think, if it's truly going to be categorized as luck, then it has to be given in such a way that you don't want to be recognized for it and you don't expect anything in return.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that sometimes is the trick, right? Like, are you giving to get back? Because then that's not luck, right?
Right.
That's selfish transactionalism.
Yes. And that's Marcus Aurelius phrases that. It's goodness is good just for the sake of being good.
That's right.
That's the fruit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There's this thing happening right now. I don't know. I mean, I struggle with this because I see things that happen in our society and I think that's so good. And then at the same time I go, but God, why do we have to do that? So I don't know if you've seen this, but there's this thing now where people are wearing sweatshirts and on the back of the sweatshirt, it's like, hey, to the person behind me in line, like, you really matter, or I care about you, or something like that. And like on the surface, I think that's coming from this thing of like, let's spread more good in the world and And I just happened to see on social media last night somebody, posting a picture about seeing that sweatshirt and like, oh, to that person wearing that sweatshirt, thank you so much. That meant so much to me. And I'm like, isn't that interesting? Like, is this some sort of a weird bid for recognition that you're doing this in the first place? Is it a true altruistic good? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's complicated. It's hard to get, like you said, a truly altruistic act. And I would even say it's really hard to give it. I find myself testing my intentions all the time. And sometimes you'll do something good for someone. And if you poke yourself and you're honest with yourself enough, sometimes there's a selfish reason in there. It's like you're not doing it just for the sake of goodness. You're doing it for something.
That's right.
And that's a hard thing to contend with, right? Because you think, well, it's still a good act, right? Of course, the Stoics say no. Intentions are everything.
Right. But see, so like I even think about this. These are the thoughts that I have with myself while I'm walking for hours at a time. Right? It's like, how does virtue even fit into this? Like, why are we being virtuous? Why are we called to be virtuous? Is it in and of itself an absolute good, or is it because there's some belief that leads somewhere?
That's the interesting conundrum, right? Because you could say Stoicism isn't about pleasure seeking, but you could say the state of eudaimonia is one of pleasure.
Right? Yeah. So I go round and round and round, and I go, okay, I have to stop thinking about this because I'm driving myself nuts. But yeah. I mean, I love Stoic philosophy, and I love the idea of philosophy. And I talk to people all the time about how they need to have a philosophy because it's, if we boil it down to what it's really intended to mean, it's about a kind of a recipe or a plan for life. Right?
Yes.
A philosophy is intended to simplify what life is all about. Right. And so, yes, if Stoicism is about, essentially putting good into the world and being called to be a virtuous person and, looking at, courage and wisdom, etc. Right? Well, that's great. That helps me to simplify how I want to be and how I want to live. But it's not that simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
The pursuit of these things, or even the attempt to achieve some of, what the principles stand for, that is a very mercurial and very challenging task.
Once you get into the details and the weeds, it's very complicated. Mm-hmm. And once you start, because you mentioned earlier about how you have these thoughts and you're trying to wrestle and contend with them, that is Stoicism.
Right.
Like, that's the whole thing. It's like there's nothing else but you get a thought and you analyze it. You think, where the hell is that coming from?
Yeah.
And sometimes that thought is coupled with a negative emotion. And that's what makes it hard. Because you think, I'm pissed off about something. But you have to say, okay, that's me, kind of, but not really. Who I really am is the rational person who's going to look at that emotion and evaluate it and dissect it and figure out where the hell it came from.
Right.
But it's hard to show people that.
Yeah.
The internal dialogue and the contemplation and the, you say something and then you think, did I mean that? Was that true? Or did I just, am I lying to myself?
Am I just filling space just to do it? Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and even, I do much better with this in theory than practice, but like even the notion of categorizing emotions as negative or positive, like I'm really trying to get myself out of that. Right. And again, I think that's a very Stoic calling, to just sort of see it, somewhat dispassionately and not get too hooked by it. Right. But that's easier when it's something that feels pleasurable versus something that feels painful.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. We yeah. And it's a hard sell sometimes. Stoicism can be a hard sell because you think, well, what do you mean we're not going to, engage in pleasure seeking? And it's like, it's a long-term game.
It is.
Stoicism is a marathon.
Yeah.
The benefits come along the race, but certainly, probably closer to the end.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. But I even was having a conversation earlier today about, I wasn't naming it as a Stoicism because of the group of people I was with, but we were talking about, meeting reality as it is, and like, what if that reality is, maybe problematic for whatever reason, and really talking about the dichotomy of control. And like, what we have to do here is we have to look at how do we want to be with this thing, and therefore what's within our control, and how do we want to handle it, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what I see in like times nowadays is that most people, a lot of people feel really impoverished in knowing how to talk and work their way through difficult circumstances. Like they don't know how to share, if they've had an unpleasant experience with someone else. They feel really like they're just almost paralyzed in knowing how to approach that. And so they end up pulling away and isolating and avoiding and all these things that then I think take them away from, certainly living life in a Stoic kind of a way, but also it contributes to a lot of their misery, right?
Yeah. And
so even that recognition of like, I want to take more personal sort of control over what's happening, and I also don't know how, that would be a huge awareness for people to have, I think.
Recognizing that they have agency.
That's right. Instead of, I feel this way because that person is acting like this.
Yes.
Right? Because that's just, we're always disadvantaged if that's the setup, that I'm going to be happy, I'm going to be good, I'm going to do these things if and when my circumstance change, if and when that person starts to behave differently. It's like, well, we're constantly disempowered then.
Yeah. Have you noticed this, though, there's that idea of it's within my control, right? And I think once you get practice with that, it's like a relief. Like let's say I don't know, someone at work doesn't do something right. The leader says, not it's your fault. The leader says, I didn't explain that right. This is my fault. But when you start that journey, when you start that process of everything's my fault, let's say, it's kind of hard, right? Because you have to deal with that. You have to deal with the consequences of that, and you have to recognize very humbly that you're not so perfect. But I think once you get practice with that enough, and you realize your own mortality, and you're grounded, that actually becomes a freeing thing. The fact that anything is actually within your control, that is such a freeing mentality.
It really is. And I don't know how this shows up for you. I'm a very, I feel things very deeply. I'm a very sensitive person. I have very strong emotions to things when I feel something. And what I'm really trying to practice is like that idea of, like, I don't have to have an opinion. I don't have to have a reaction to everything that happens. And so I even find sometimes, like with some of my girlfriends or whatever, we'll be talking about something and we all get really animated and, we're kind of sharing feelings and venting, whatever. And I think there's value to that. And at the same time, I'm also trying to go, you can actually practice not having an emotional reaction to this thing. It's not necessary all the time. And that is it is actually quite empowering, because as much as it's kind of fun with my girlfriends, when it's constantly happening in my workplace or whatever, it's exhausting, and I also don't think it's consistent with what I want to model as a leader, that I'm just constantly led around by my emotions, right? Which would be I don't think would be very consistent with what the Stoics would suggest either.
Well, Marcus Aurelius says very plainly, you don't have to turn this into something.
That's right. And I turn things into everything. I turn everything into something.
Yeah, everything is into something. Turn something from nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of those things though that you have to remind yourself of all the time.
All the
it's
time.
Like you need it tattooed on your hand. It's like you don't have to turn this into something.
Totally.
Because how often do you get pissed off or you get upset about something and then it's like, wait a minute, do I really need to engage in this emotionally? Or
yeah, that's right. That's right. And like then if you could have that recognition, then it's like, okay, well, I'm still having all of these feelings, all these reactions. So then what do I do with it, right? So if I'm going to kind of not, call somebody up and have a vent session or like do whatever, react, send that email, whatever. If I'm not going to do that and I'm going to really try not to turn it into something, then what do I do instead, right? And lots of times it's just sit with it and wait for it to pass.
Yes.
Every rainstorm eventually runs out of rain, right?
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, that I'm glad you said that, because I think some people also get the notion that if you just change your perspective, everything just kind of, you get this blissful experience, and that's not true at all. If you're really consumed by emotion, it depends how neurotic you are, I suppose. You can change a perspective, but the whole goal of that is so that you don't cause any more chaos into the world. It's like, okay, I'm really upset about something. Okay, let me understand where that's coming from, and let me maybe remove myself if I have to. Let me maybe do some deep breathing or whatever I have to do to calm down. But that doesn't mean that you just enter this state of bliss and that the emotion goes away. It's like you said, sometimes if you get a big emotional response, it doesn't just turn off. It has to fade. And you have to sit in that. And
you have to keep choosing it, I think.
You do.
Because if there's something that's really, let's say, gotten under my skin and I'm trying to practice being within a different way and I'm trying to adopt a more stoic sort of mentality towards it, well, I can do that. And there's I'm happy that I've sort of had that recognition or awareness, but that sometimes means I'm waiting for the thing to metabolize for maybe it's 12 hours, maybe it's overnight, maybe it's a full day, and that's, to me, that's part of the commitment.
Yeah. And how do you deal with that with stuff with work, for example, where you have to, I don't know, you have to be stern, and maybe you get something that gives you an emotional response, and it's something that you have to deal with. Maybe it's an organizational thing, maybe it's a political thing, because that's all in business as well. So how do you get yourself to, I guess, act in a way that aligns with your professional behavior, but is also stoic, I suppose?
Yeah, I'm working on it. I mean, the ideal is that, and I really do actually try to put this into practice where, people who come to work with me and work intimately are oftentimes surprised at how much of an emotional basket case I am, because I think what they see is very different from what they get. And I'm like, well, this is how the sausage is made. So, you're either on board or not. So, I mean, I really...
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
That's the second time that happened last
oh, no way.
I had the outro music, and I swear I muted it, so I don't... Anyways. I am pretty good at sort of like, I do know, sort of how I want my professional identity to be, and I don't respond to things quickly, and, I have a
very close group of sort of the wise counsel that I can kind of let myself be as I am with. But I'm really mindful, and I'm partly a bit critical of myself right now because I don't think I've done a great job of this over the last number of months, because we've had this big thing that we've been involved with, and it has been political, and me with all my emotions, wearing them on my sleeve, I haven't really reined that in. So, if nothing else, I do speak to it, right? Like I do speak to the fact that I'm kind of sometimes indulging myself and letting my emotions out onto the open road to see where they go, and trying to keep learning from it. Honestly, that's it.
And asking for a friend, how do you balance that with, I suppose, just, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but because I struggle with this, how do you balance that with just having confidence in what you do? Because it's easy to say, okay, well, here's my ideal, and I did not live up to that at all today.
And that's like every day.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question though, because like, what does confidence mean in that sense then? Right? Like I have tremendous confidence in what I have to offer. Like I do believe in that. And, I a lot of that is because I've worked really hard to sort of learn and kind of gather experience and all of the things. And I've been through a lot, certainly in this business that I run, for sure. So I do have a deep belief, like a really, really deep foundational belief in what I am trying to do and what we're trying to do with the work that we're doing. And so that really, I may have a dysregulated day, and that doesn't really get shaken. Confidence in myself or in what I'm doing or what I'm presenting. You were speaking a moment or so ago about fear. I mean, I'm constantly full of fear. I just do it anyways, right? And I don't know. I don't know if that is, like, I don't see that as related to self-confidence or confidence in what I have to offer. I see the two as sort of a bit separate. What I am confident in from a behavioral perspective is that I know I'll keep trying to improve. Right? Like that sort of, I know I'll get back up.
But maybe that's actually the key, is that your ability to deal with your own insufficiencies is tied to how willing you are to confront those insufficiencies.
Yeah.
Because if you lie to yourself, let's say for a year as the leader of a team, and say that everyone loves you and everyone is aligned with exactly what you're doing, and you never ask for feedback, and then all of a sudden you find out one day that everyone freaking hates you. Like, that's like you're falling off a cliff, right?
Right.
Whereas if you purposefully and fully engage in that process every day or every time you guys have a meeting of, listen, what more can I do? What better job can I do for you? Whatever it is, and you take that feedback, there's going to be a little ego death in there, right? Because you think you know everything, and you don't. So there's going to be a little ego death in there. But if you don't do that, the consequences is that your ego grows, and eventually reality is going to snap back, and then the fall is going to be more catastrophic. So you seem very good at regularly engaging in that process of self-evaluation.
Well, thank you for saying that. I hope that's true. And it's just funny. Like, I mean, the former scenario you painted of like thinking everyone likes me and whatever, like that's not where I live at all. Like, I just generally assume that people think that what I talk about is bullshit. So anything that's not that is great. And that's not great either, right? Like, I'm trying to work on that too, because it's like, okay, am I self-handicapping to try to protect myself from that inevitable fall? Probably in some kinds of ways. But, but also when I was in grad school, I had a couple of I had many, many amazing professors, but I had a couple in particular stand out. And one of them was, we were learning acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's a third wave mindfulness-based approach to treatment. And like our entire supervision for years was like, you have to be non-judgmental and not non-judgmental, non-defensive, and non-judgmental towards the process of receiving feedback. So like, it was like, we're going to tell you things and do this and do that. And the calling here is to really receive these things as gifts and not to take it personally. Right. So I think I was really sort of steeped in that approach. And so receiving feedback, especially if it's around what I can improve on. I mean, it stings, like I think it does for anyone, but I also really try to welcome it, because I was just schooled that way. I was sort of brought up that way.
Yeah.
You know, way easier said than done.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's really hard. I think we often go through life, a lot of us, and we don't want to look at that part of ourselves that isn't living up to our potential.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think it's easy to do that. It's easy to do it at work. It's easy to do it in relationships too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're just not willing to look at that. I think it's just like a natural feeling, for me anyway. I mean, I can only really speak to myself, but I think when I get feedback, there's the perspective of, okay, this is better for me in the long run, and that allows me to take it in properly. But the initial response is, no, I don't want to hear this, right?
Totally. And I think sometimes, totally. And sometimes she whines. Like, I'm tired of receiving feedback. Like, I don't always want to be working on myself or whatever, okay? Yeah. It's like, fine, I'm flawed and I suck at this. And can I just be there
Let
for
me
a
go
while?
to sleep.
Right, exactly. I'll be on the ground. Find me in 6 months. Yeah, it is. You know, like, I think sometimes the pursuit of being the best version of ourselves is kind of relentless. Sometimes I just want to eat the cake.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what's the perspective that allows you to keep on the journey?
Yeah. It's that sometimes I'm just going to eat the cake.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that's it. I think there has to be this paradoxical balancing, you know? Like, the more I deny myself, the worse I'm actually going to be in terms of how I want to live my life and what I think is important in how I live my life.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Anyways. I don't have it all figured out by any stretch, you know. I think that I think there's a lot that we can really benefit from in a lot of these ancient teachings that are just so relevant. There's nothing that I read in any of the Stoic philosophers that I don't go, you could have written this last week, you know, maybe in slightly different language, but you know, which I take a lot of comfort in. And I guess that's partly why I've been able to buy into it so significantly, is because, you know, if this has been around, you know, really since we were evolving as a species and living in these communal ways, well, obviously there's something to it, you know, and there's such simplicity or elegance in its simplicity. It's like, why wouldn't we want to sort of adopt this, you know, full stop, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I find meditations particularly helpful in that regard, because you read meditations and what you have to realize is that he's saying that to himself. So, you know, we think of Marcus Aurelius, we read it and he'll say something like, I don't know, don't let people piss you off during the day, and have the perspective that they share in the divine with you and yada yada. And people think, oh, that's a great perspective, what a wise person. But they're not seeing how many times he probably snapped at people for being rude. They're not seeing why he had to write that down that day. Right. And I think that's, man, I mean, he was just a human being, just like everyone else.
Right. I think about that too sometimes. I think about, like, God, what must a day in his life have been like? You know, like
Roman emperor.
Right. Yeah. And, like, you know, times when he was away from home and all of the things he had to contend with and the assassination attempts. Like, I mean, how was he not a basket case?
Yeah.
Maybe he was.
Right. And probably.
Yeah. Probably.
And that's why he wrote so much and journaled so much. And,
yeah.
You know, like, you don't journal about something that you're okay with. Yeah. Normally you write a book about things you've learned. Right. But when you're journaling, you're trying to figure out how to make your own life better.
Yeah, you're trying to ease the burden on your soul or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I sometimes think about that question of, like, you know, if you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be? And, man, I'd love to sit down and pick his brain a little bit. Hey, maybe he'd be a total jerk. Like, maybe he'd be the worst dinner partner ever.
We don't really know. I mean, we have a lot of documentation on him, I suppose. Yeah. And maybe Donald Robertson would be the guy to ask.
Yeah, totally.
He told me that he was just a big nerd, basically. Marcus Aurelius, but he was also a warrior. So, I mean, but he was an emperor. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
He's probably a nerd. Who knows who he was? But he wasn't a deity for sure.
Right.
Sometimes we think about him like that, but it's just a human being.
Totally. But I mean, what an interesting human being. Like, what, you know, I love the idea of all the different selves we have inside of ourselves, right? And I just think, you know, he's just such a brilliant example of that. Like, he was so multidimensional, it seems, you know, at least from what we understand.
Yeah, it is. I mean, human beings are so much potential. Like could really be anything. I mean, you look, even like Epictetus and Seneca. Look at what they did, what they wrote, and I mean Seneca somewhat maybe a little bit. He had a bit of hubris on this. He said, "I'm writing for the next thousands of years." Like he had this idea that he wasn't writing for his generation. He was writing for the next 2,000 years. And it's funny is that everyone's buying letters from a Stoic now.
That's right. That's right. So like, was he prescient in some kind of a way, or was he just a guy with a really big ego?
Yeah.
Right. Or did he have that sense of being, not being of the time he was in?
Yeah.
Like, do you ever have that feeling, that sense of like you were born too early or too late or something like that?
I did when I was younger. I haven't had it in a while.
Yeah. I sometimes think, for sure. And I don't know. I definitely think I was born too late. I think I was supposed to have been born at a different and earlier generation. But then I contrast that with how I live my life as a woman, and I recognize I wouldn't have had the same liberties and freedoms, right? Yeah. Sometimes I think, I sometimes feel like I don't belong, and not in a negative, painful kind of way, but I feel different from a lot of people.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have a lot of contemporaries. I don't know, but I do feel that sometimes, and I'm not sure if that's a generational thing or if that's just a me thing. And I've gotten more comfortable with that as I've gotten older, for sure. Like I'm kind of okay just as I am, but I don't know that I feel like I belong to any particular group or section of people.
Yeah, I felt the same way when I was younger, and I don't know now. I don't know. I don't feel that way much anymore. Do you still feel that way? Or you still do?
I think I've kind of come to peace with it. Like I feel like I don't feel like I've ever had the same kinds of instincts or instinctual needs maybe that a lot of my contemporaries have had, and that makes me feel a little bit different. And I've just kind of come to a place of, it's not a bad difference, it's just different.
Yeah. I try and take the putting my own words into Stoic philosophy here, but I tell myself that I belong wherever I am right now. Yeah. And if you practice that, eventually you start to feel it.
So what does that mean to you?
It means right here, right now is the most important thing. This is where I'm supposed to be.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not to say that you can't change paths and make yourself somewhere different in the future. But what it means is right now in this present moment, this is where I belong. This is where I'm supposed to be.
Does that mean it was predestined?
In some sense, I suppose. I mean, it's a weird thing in Stoic philosophy, the fate versus free will thing, because there is kind of this idea that everything's preordained, but then there's this idea that you have agency, right? So it's like life kind of pushes you, and you choose which way to fall. It's kind of like that. But I think like even in the situation where, let's say you I don't know, you do something that you shouldn't do, and you find yourself, I don't know, really drunk and hopped up on drugs or something downtown Halifax, right? Like you're in this bad state. If you can even have the perspective of maybe this is actually where I need to be, like maybe this is where I actually belong right now. And it's not to say that that's where you want to be, but it's like maybe I can use this experience to make myself better, to make myself, or to push myself to where I want to go, because that's all you have, right?
Well, and I think that's the leaning into suffering.
Yeah.
Like don't let any crisis or tragedy or difficult time go to waste, like find something to take from it. But I think that's easier said than done when you're sitting here, you and I having a conversation, than when you're in it,
Yeah. And sometimes it feels like the suffering takes something from you. And it's almost like it takes like the romantic notion of life that you had in your head from you.
That is such a good point.
Yeah, it's depressing, but
well, yeah, it is kind of, I guess, right? Like I think, you maybe lose a bit of innocence.
Yes.
You maybe get a little bit harder, or I'm not sure if cynical is the right word. I don't know that I feel cynical, but definitely tougher, like a harder perspective on things.
Yeah, cynicism is tempting, right? Nihilism is really tempting. And cynicism seems to be like a compromise of like, I won't go into nihilism, but maybe I'll become really cynical, right? But I don't know. It's a hard thing, because the Stoics do have a romantic view of life, but it's based in reality. And you can have a romantic view of life that's not based in reality. And that's where I think when you have experiences, you feel like you've lost something, and you've lost something that in the Stoic sense you don't need because it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's
and we're
weird.
saying that maybe that's the price to pay for the things you gain.
Yes.
Right? Like you lose a bit of innocence, you lose a bit of naivete, but you gain a bit of wisdom in its place.
Yes. Yes. And by gaining wisdom, you gain virtue.
Right. Yeah. Like, can you be innocent and wise?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
It reminds me of another. Tyson had this football player on, and he said, "No one knows the violence it took to become this gentle." And I've been mulling that over in my head, right? And I think, well, how can you think about that in a Stoic sense? And it's like, nobody knew the vice it took to become this virtuous. Nobody knew the foolishness it took to become this wise.
Right.
No one knew the cowardice it took to become this courageous.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, those are truly, they're the opposite sides of the coin that must live together.
Yes.
You know, like, I think there's something really, a real truism in that, right? Like, in order to be able to love deeply and fully, you also probably need to be able to hate, you know, because they are on the opposite sides of the spectrum, right?
Yeah. At least the potential to.
The potential to, yeah. Maybe not the actual lived experience of it, but the potential to, you know. I think those things, those seemingly experiences that live in opposition, they're actually bedfellows. They have to exist together.
Yeah.
You know, like I work very hard at it. It's very important to me. It does come, I mean, I work hard at it and it comes naturally, I guess, at really trying to be thoughtful and considerate and generous and empathic and aware of, you know, the people that I love, what would make them happy, what they need, And I believe that has developed because I have also confronted how deeply selfish I can be.
Yes.
And there's maybe like a rebound and maybe almost an atonement for that. But I really, because I sometimes pause and I think about it and I go, where does this come from? And I think that's it. You know, like we were just talking about, I think some of the motivation and the ambition and the energy and the movement forward is also because there's the sloth, you know, just waiting to emerge, you know?
Yeah.
And I think you have to befriend both. Like I was saying, like I'm a very fearful person. I live with tons of sort of anxiety or whatever. And I have to understand that the other side of that is the motivation and the willingness to take risks. And that for me is a necessary ingredient for courage. I don't love it.
It's not pleasant.
Yeah.
You mentioned atonement.
Yeah.
I got to pick your brain about that because that's interesting. I think about that concept a lot. That idea of coming to terms with your own vice, let's say. But it's not something, I don't think the Stoics address it very well or even at all. It just didn't seem to be, like their idea was you mess up, you look at it rationally, you use it to move yourself forward. But there does seem to be the case that Jordan Peterson said, no one gets away with anything ever. And I kind of think that's true. I don't think you get away with anything.
At the very least or the very most, you have to live with it.
Yes, your conscience. Yeah.
You have to know, and I think that's it, right? It's like, you know, there's this thing inside of you where you have actually confronted the things that you're capable of. You know, and so that's interesting. Like, atonement is, I would say, in many ways, a pro-social activity, right? You know, like. In recovery circles, there's this notion of sort of living amends, and you live your life. You know, you can't undo the harm or the hurt you've maybe caused historically, but you can live your life in such a way moving forward that you don't continue to replicate those hurts, and the positive you put in and the ways you are carrying, etc., is a living amends for how you used to be. Like, isn't that in and of itself a pro-social behavior?
Yeah, I never thought about it like that. That's very interesting. I'll have to think on that.
Okay.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Because I have to think of redemption as well, in the sense that how do you redeem yourself in the Stoic sense for, let's say, engaging in vice? It's like by accepting it and moving forward from it based on what you've learned from it, right? And just being willing to confront that, to get back to the feedback thing. It's like, how do you redeem yourself for the fact that you're not a perfect leader? It's like you stare at it. You stare at the fact that you are not a perfect leader, and you use that information to make yourself a better leader. That's the answer. That's the only form of redemption, and I think in the Stoic sense.
Totally. And I think, like, if I just keep going with sort of the recovery idea, I mean, I know there's controversy around the 12 steps and blah, 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 but I do think that, what the steps call people to do in terms of, like, writing out the inventory of all of the, bad things you did, all the vices you engaged in and the behavior that came from that, and then sharing that with another person. To me, that's exactly that act. It's like, let's look at this thing, and in the willingness to really deeply, non-defensively, openly look at it, in some ways you set it free, and then you are able to refocus on what you're going to put into the world instead.
Yeah.
So you don't wear these things around as like a hair shirt and this, albatross around your neck and whatever. You actually try to transmute it into, okay, I can't do anything to change that, but now I can act in these redeeming ways. I can act in these atoning ways.
In your profession, do you find that takes a toll in a sense? I mean, like you have to speak with a lot of people that have been through a lot of experiences. And I think part of, you mentioned sharing it with someone, but the person that you're sharing it with, they have to be willing to, I guess, engage in that as well, and almost empathetically, in the Stoic, it's complicated. The Stoic perspective is complicated on this, but you kind of have to feel it a little bit, right? Like Carl Rogers had this idea in therapy that you couldn't change your patient unless you let him change you. And I think like that sort of give and take in the relationship. But I mean, I in your profession, I'm sure you hear and you have to have those conversations a lot, and you have to face that a lot. I mean, do you find that takes a toll on you, or do you manage it? Have you found a way to manage it?
I think some of what we're talking about today is all of the management stuff, right?
Okay,
like,
yeah.
Having a philosophy and trying to live in accordance with it and doing all of these things. And I do think that, like, for sure, that kind of loss of innocence or whatever, like, I don't know where I would have been had I done something else 20 plus years ago, right? I only know where I am now. And yeah, I think there's a hardness maybe, or a loss of innocence or whatever. Some of that not belonging I was talking about, that plays into this in some respect, because there's lots of things that I think I understand about the world, or a way that I look at the world, that would be really different from a lot of people. And I don't share it with a lot of people because that's not, they are happy to not know, right?
Right.
And so I think it can be, it's, in some ways it's easy to be hard.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that recognition is the important part. And, the people that I try to help, it's really hard, I think, for people to kind of acknowledge that, and then also try to, curry whatever amount of optimism or hope they can still connect to keep trying to have positivity in their lives, like the people that I work with, who I admire and respect and have such deep caring for. I mean, these are people who have been through and seen things that no one ever should, and they're still doing what we're talking about, trying to be loved, trying to give love, trying to find peace, trying to, live in accordance with a whole set of values. And there's all sorts of stuff that gets in the way of that. And a lot of times it's not fair, right? And I think that's one of the hardest things about life, is that so much of what we have to be willing to accept is not fair, and it lacks justice.
Yeah. For sure.
So
I've always, I often think, you meet some people sometimes, and if you ask them the right questions, they'll tell you about the terrible situation they're currently dealing with. They'll go on, I'm getting divorced, and this is happening, and that's happening, and it's like, God, people really go through shit, and God, it's one of those things where it's like, what do you do to help those people? It's like sometimes all you really have to do is listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just have to sit in the suffering with them and
Mm-hmm.
and feel what they're saying. And people also know, which is interesting. You know, if I tell you about a traumatic experience that I had and you're clued out thinking about something else, like I know it.
Of course you do.
And everyone knows it. And that's so interesting that, you know, you can just talk and it's therapeutic. But talking and having someone actually listen, that's therapy.
Yeah, and that's unique, right?
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right. 99% of what people need is just to be listened to, you know? And like that is really, how many conversations do you have during the day, do I have during the day, where we're not actually, I mean, we're listening or engaging with what the other person's saying, but we're really just waiting for our turn to talk, right?
Yes.
I mean, we're so self-absorbed, right? Yeah. And so creating the context to really just be with someone, and that can be in conversation or just be, you know, that is so precious. And I think that just feels so validating, you know, somebody can feel so supported just by you being willing to actually give of your time and your attention and yourself. That's it, you know. People will call me up often, this just happened in our family, or my wife is going through that, what should I do? And I sometimes feel like I'm supposed to, you know, have all the answers to this stuff, and really it's not a very sexy one, right? It just truly is follow their lead, you know, convey in all the ways that you can that you are paying attention and that you love them and that you're there, and be as consistent as you possibly can be. But you know, the doing of things is more about our need because we feel helpless. It's oftentimes very little to do with what the person actually needs. Yes.
We feel like we should be doing something, but that's for us. That's not for them. You know, and if they want something, if they need something, that's a different story. But like I said, a lot of times it's just having presence. It's having someone that's willing to share some of the suffering that you're going through with you.
That's exactly it.
And so, what's interesting about that is if I share my suffering with you through dialogue, it seems the totality of it seems to go down. And then if you share your suffering with me, the totality of it goes down. Whereas, let's say individually we go off and sit in our rooms and we're suffering alone, that's more suffering than if we share it with each other. So even though I have to suffer a little bit to hear your suffering, and you have to suffer a little bit to hear my suffering, the totality of it is significantly less than if we don't discuss it at all.
Right. And I think a practical exercise that you can do, and I can't remember there was a program I used to be part of, and I can't remember which one it was, but the exercise that I was taught was, you know, you could take a bag or you could even just take a glass of water and just hold your arm outstretched. And, you know, initially it's like nothing, but the longer you keep it there, and somebody else could come along and sort of share it with you. And it's not that it stops hurting or, you know, being painful over time, because even something super small, if it's just right over time, it's going to hurt and your arm's going to get tired, whatever. But the distribution of that pain and of that weight, if you have somebody with you, right? I think that's just a beautiful example of what we're trying to do emotionally.
Right.
You know, I think what, you know, I was taught early on, and I believe this, and this has always been kind of how I've been oriented, is like the value of kind of getting into the inner world of another person, you know. And if you let me into your inner world and you sort of let me into the darkest parts of where it hurts, right? That's actually probably where it's going to feel the best for you.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people struggle to do that.
Yeah.
You know, for whatever reason, because of outdated or unfair beliefs they've erected, or some thought about, you know, having that they should be able to do things on their own, or whatever the case may be, you know.
Well, it's hard too, because you have to be vulnerable in order to gain that intimacy. And that's the tricky thing, because it's like, okay, can you tell someone that you love let's say the anger issues that you've had in the past? It's like, that's going to be a hard thing to admit, right? And you're probably still going to be struggling with it. It's like, that's a hard thing to talk about. And you might think, well, maybe if I tell them that, maybe they won't love me. But if you do, and they do love you, that's where intimacy comes from. That's where the real deepest connection is. It's not looking at the person that you show the world on Instagram. It's like when you're talking about letting people into your inner world, it's not the good stuff. It's the darker stuff. It's the vice. It's
the messy stuff.
The messy stuff.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you that, the risk that someone might take in sharing the messiness and really going to that sort of vulnerable, like, here's my underbelly, I'm trusting you to see it, and the experience of that being accepted. I mean, that's profound. That can be so corrective. I think, we've increasingly started using the word vulnerability almost as like a punchline. And, because I think if we're encouraging people to be vulnerable, to really open themselves up, then, if somebody does that with you and you've been encouraging them to, then you damn well better be there to be accepting of what they have to offer.
Right.
That doesn't have to mean you condone it, but if somebody takes the risk of saying this vice or that problem or this history or whatever, and you've asked for it, then man, you better treat that like as sacred.
100%. And the benefit of that for you is you get to offer yourself as well, and your not right. so pretty side.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And guess what? That's most of what we're made of.
Yeah.
Right? I agree. It's like there's the versions that we present, and we have, as I said, we have our different selves, and the parts of ourselves we're, more comfortable with letting the majority of the world see. But really the stuff that makes us who we are is the stuff that's underneath all that.
Yeah. And what's cool about that is that you would never think that. Like most people wouldn't think that, like what makes someone your wife or your husband. It's like, it's knowing that stuff.
Yeah.
That's what it's not the nice stuff. It's knowing all of it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And the world is probably going to know some of the good or most of the good. They might know some of the ugly, but are they going to really know? Are they going to really know what you're struggling with internally on a daily basis? And it's the imperfections that make someone yours.
That's right. That's right. And the warts and all, and the fact that, you show the warts and all, and you continue to choose on an hourly and a daily basis to be in that relationship or with that person or to accept those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, that is really intimacy. And I don't know. I don't know if, I think when people feel that, when they have the experience of that, then they know.
Yeah. But it's scary. Oh, that was funny.
What was that?
It was Siri. That was scary. Like, what is going on?
Thanks, Siri.
But yeah, she wants to get in on the conversation.
Yeah, totally.
But it is scary because, again, the vulnerability aspect of it, by definition, it means that someone can take advantage of that. And so vulnerability is an act. It's an act of courage, and it's an act of strength. But people do. The other side of this stuff, we talked about intimacy and all this stuff, but the other side is some people do actually get taken advantage of that, of being vulnerable. And that's where you lead into cynicism, right? Totally,
because I think, sometimes people confuse self-disclosure with intimacy, right? And then they don't have the healthiest of emotional boundaries. And so their testing ground is they're just going to put everything out on the table. And that does put them in a disadvantaged position for somebody who doesn't have the right intentions to, exploit that in some kind of a way, you know? And why is somebody doing that? Because they're seeking intimacy, they're seeking care, they're seeking connection. They just don't necessarily, they haven't figured out yet how to keep themselves safe and protected in the pursuit of that.
Yes. And I think that's wisdom. I think it's wisdom and it's courage. It's courage because it's not courageous if you're just naive.
Right.
It's not courage because you think the world is a fairy tale and no one's going to hurt you. The courageous act is to be vulnerable and know someone can take advantage of you.
And be discerning in how you are vulnerable and open and the things that you share about yourself, right? And have a process of experimentation to do that, right? Like, I could tell you every single thing about me and all of the things that I'm ashamed of and proud of and my wishes and hopes and all those kinds of things. I could lay that all bare for you right now. And yeah, we might know each other a bit better. You'd know a lot more about me, but we probably wouldn't feel tremendously more intimate because you can't force it, right? It has to be the thing that evolves and grows and, you nurture over time, right? And it's like a kind of a funnel going downwards, right? And you're only going to get to the bottom after you've really nurtured it and really kind of let yourself take increasing risks over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. It just takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. It's not something that, you go on a first date with someone and then you just unload everything.
But I think a lot of people do that because they're craving that connection and they think that that's the pathway in. But what they don't actually realize is that that's probably actually a detraction to true intimacy, right? Because it's trying to, it's treating yourself as something that you can transact.
And that's such a great point, because what that means is that you have to have some level of strength and virtue prior to being able to fully engage in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. That's right. You have to be able to show up and be able to tolerate what it feels like to want to share and give and progress, and maybe not have that met, in which case you have to, not be able to progress in the intimacy you were hoping was going to happen. That takes a lot of strength, right?
Yeah, and a lot of time.
And time, yeah.
That's awesome.
It's like you can't force love, right? Like we can't just decide to walk outside and the next person we see we're going to fall in love with. It doesn't work like that.
Right. And I also think that it like true love, it has to come from a place not of necessity.
Yes.
But of voluntarily engaging in it.
1,000%.
And if you're, to use a bad word, desperate, that really shows, and people can really smell that. So you have to come into it with a level of strength and let's say even an ability to really manage the stuff on your own, but you're wise enough to see the benefit of opening up and of becoming more vulnerable with this person over the long term.
Mm-hmm. I mean, aren't we just a series of paradoxes?
Oh yeah,
as human beings,
that's
right?
That's where you have to poke, is the paradoxes.
That's right. You have to find that space in between, right? Because I completely believe that when you are really comfortable in yourself and in your skin and with yourself, and you can spend time alone and you're good and you got your life, right? Paradoxically, that's going to be when you meet the person who's going to just disrupt the shit out of that, right? And all of a sudden it's like there's going to be this meeting and this connection and attraction and all of the things, right? Versus if you're kind of on your own and hating it and desperate and seeking and pursuing and whatever, it's like desert.
Yeah.
Right?
And people think that has some sort of like magical or voodoo quality to it, but it's not.
It's not.
It's because your internal state is different.
Exactly.
And that manifests itself in the world. And that's not an unscientific thing.
Exactly. That isn't an unscientific. That it totally relates to then how you're relating with the world and what you're putting out there. You know, and if you're so desperate in a way for that connection, you'll find it. It just probably won't be what we're talking about.
Right.
The bottom end of the funnel.
Yes.
That'll be the title of my book.
There you go. The bottom end of the funnel.
End of the funnel. We'll write it together.
Yes, let's do it. We're almost 2 hours in. This might be the longest I've ever went. Yeah.
Holy, I did not
Flew
know
by.
that. Yeah,
hour
really did.
46.
Holy shoot.
And we Siri only interrupted once. So
that was awesome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure to have you here.
You too.
And please, whenever you're in town, let me know, and we'll do it again. Yeah. It's such a pleasure to talk with in person.
Oh my God, I love it.
I interview a few people in Halifax here from time to time, and people who I can find. It's such a privilege.
Oh, it's so much better. It's so much better than the screens. Are you ever in Calgary?
No, man. I've never been to Alberta.
Oh, you haven't?
No, BC, Ontario, never Alberta.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know when I'll be back, but we'll do this again.
Yeah, for sure.
Totally.
Any last words? Where can people find you if they're interested?
Oh, sure. Well, people can find me all over the place.
Halifax.
Halifax, that's right. Let's see here. So in Canada, you can find me at wayfound.ca. You can find me in the US at beforeoperationalstress.com. Dr. Megan Mick on Instagram. That's probably all that's required at this juncture. Yeah.
I think the audience knows you anyway from the last time we spoke. What was that, 3 months ago? 3 or 4?
I was trying to think that. I think it's got to have been in the new year, right? After Christmas? Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. It was after Tim died, so it was in February.
January, February. It was February, was it? Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's not that long ago, actually.
No.
Yeah. Okay, well, my thoughts haven't evolved that much, so.
The months go slow and fast at the same time.
Totally.
It's so weird.
Yeah, it really is.
It's like Seneca says, life is short, but it's also long.
Yeah.
It's like,
there's a paradox,
what the hell
right?
do you mean by that?
Yeah. Totally.
All right. Thanks so much.
You're
Until next
awesome.
time.
Thank you for having me.